I had a friend growing up that lived in the middle of nowhere, nothing but miles of forest on every side. Me and my buddy would go gallivanting through the woods in the evening and through the night. One night we were messing around in the woods as usual. There was another friend with us too. It must have been around midnight when we started hearing a pretty weird noise. We could tell that something was walking around maybe 200 feet away from us. Pretty far away, but it was so quiet we could hear it moving. We grouped up together and were dead silent. We all knew something was off without saying a thing to each other. I can still feel the chills today. We stood there for what felt like 30 minutes, barely even breathing. Several minutes had gone by with us not hearing a thing. I was standing in the woods around us, desperately trying to locate the thing that was walking around. I was afraid that it was a person trying to mess with us or even hurt us. I was not sure if we were on someone else's property or not. It was dead silent. I'm talking quieter than quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. Out of nowhere, an ear-shattering screech exploded out of the silence. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. It sounded like it was coming from every direction. It was deep too, not like a bird. It sounded like it came from something huge. We bolted immediately without so much as looking at each other. I ran so fast I was smashing through branches and small trees. My face was getting absolutely destroyed by branches. There was so much adrenaline coursing through my body, it felt like I was flying. Couldn't even feel my feet hit the ground. It must have been a quarter-mile run back to the house. We all made a break for the garage after getting out of the woods. My third friend immediately collapsed onto the floor once we made it into the garage. He started sobbing uncontrollably, murmuring a prayer to himself. That's when I really started freaking out because it validated that I was not the only one that heard that. We were an absolute wreck the rest of the night. The third friend refused to ever go back. I hung out there a few times after that, but never went back out into the woods during the night. That experience has made me extremely on edge anytime I'm in the woods. Had nightmares about it for about a year after. Still have no idea what it was. A person messing with us, a skinwalker, or some kind of other entity. Back in 2021, my husband and I were camping in Wyoming at the Boise Reservoir. We got really lucky and we were able to book a beachfront site directly leading to the water, but the downside was that it was very, very far from the other campsites. We were essentially isolated from everyone else. At the time, though, it sounded like a dream come true. The thing about Wyoming is that it's so desolate to the point where it's pitch black and eerily dead silent once the sun is gone. We set up our camp, enjoyed our fire, but shortly after that, a random SUV with blacked out windows came driving down our road and into our sight. They drove toward us, and my husband tried to wave to them in case they were lost and needed help. But instead, they ignored us and drove down to the beach, stayed there for 5 minutes, turned around, and went back up the way they came. We immediately got a bad vibe. My husband told me to throw everything into the car, and he kept shining a flashlight towards the beach, because we had a feeling that they dropped someone off to watch us. After we packed up, we got into the car and hauled ass. Lo and behold, the same car drove back into our campsite, and when they saw us leaving, they actually started chasing us. Mind you, the roads in Wyoming are bumpy and unkept, and when you're in the wilderness, on top of that, the enormous wildlife that wanders in and out of the streets. My husband said I had to go fast. Are you okay with that? And I said, just go and get us out of here. We were easily going 80 miles per hour down these windy roads and even through a canyon. They were on our tail for about 10 minutes until we lost them after passing through the canyon. Probably the most terrifying experience of our lives. We think about it to this day and wonder what could have happened if we didn't listen to our gut at that moment. This story takes place in Mexico. It was the summer of 1983, a time when the days seemed to stretch endlessly and the nights were filled with the sounds of crickets. I was spending the summer at my grandfather's old farmhouse with my 3 cousins. The house was situated in a small village, and behind it stretched acres of fields and a small pond about 500 feet away from my grandfather's land. One sweltering afternoon, bored and seeking a reprieve from the heat, My cousins and I decided to visit the pond. It was a familiar spot where we'd spend countless hours swimming and playing. As we trudged through the fields, the sun beating down on us, we finally arrived at the pond. To our surprise, we saw two kids already in the water, splashing and playing. At first, we thought nothing of it, probably some kids from a nearby village. We shrugged, eager to join them, but as we got closer, something felt off. The air grew thick, almost oppressive, and a strange chill ran down my spine despite the heat. We were about 5 feet away from the pond when one of my cousins suddenly froze. His face turned ashen, eyes wide with terror. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible. This is when we realized that these weren't kids. They were duendes. The words struck fear into our hearts. In our village, tales of these gnome-like creatures were common, whispered in hushed tones around campfires. These beings resembled children, but were known to drown anyone who got too close. As my cousin's words sank in, I looked closer at the figures in the water. Their movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and their eyes were too dark, too lifeless. They stopped playing and turned to stare at us, their expressions twisted into eerie, knowing smiles. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and a wave of cold terror washed over me. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted back to my grandfather's house, our hearts pounding in our chests. The distance that had seemed so short now felt like an eternity. As we ran, I could almost feel their malevolent gaze following us, hear the faint, mocking laughter carried on the breeze. When we finally burst through the door, gasping for breath, we tried to explain what we had seen. Words tumbled out in a jumbled mess, each of us trying to outdo the other in our frantic recounting. Our grandfather listened with a bemused expression. "Nonsense," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "There are no such thing as duendes." But my parents felt different. Their faces paled, and they exchanged worried glances. They believed us, or at least believed enough to take precautions. The next day, they took me to the village shaman to be cleansed, a ritual meant to ward off any lingering malevolent spirits. Only I was cleansed, as they believed I had been the closest to the duendes. The ritual was both strange and comforting. Despite my initial skepticism, I felt a sense of peace wash over me as the ritual concluded. To this day, the memory of that summer remains vivid. The sight of those not quite children, the palpable fear, and the uneasy feeling that lingered long after that encounter. My cousins and I never spoke of it again, as if uttering the words might summon the duendes back. Whether they were truly duendes or something else entirely, I can't say for certain. But one thing is clear. Some stories, no matter how outlandish, have a way of gripping you with a fear that feels all too real.